Most people using OKRs get confused by key results, and ironically, they do this by following the rules too closely. I'm a very pragmatic person, and to me, the only good reason to use OKRs is to get better outcomes for your business and for your team. That is it. So following rules is not the goal of OKRs. Implementing perfect OKRs is not the goal. The goal is to get better results. And the thing is, to get better results, you have to do that in the context you are in, not in an idealized context where everyone is perfect. In reality, we have ambiguity, where our strategies are imperfect. We have teams with deficiencies. We have misunderstandings and errors, and everything keeps changing. So the system we manage with, OKRs in our case, has to account for this and deliver the best results we can, given what we have. So if you've learned about or used OKRs before, you've probably been swamped with ways to write the perfect key results, and it can get quite painful. Input versus outcome, leading versus lagging metrics, baselines and stretch targets, different scoring methods, and so on. If you're really unlucky, you'll have followed these rules perfectly and come up with a key result that's theoretically ideal, and yet which fell flat in reality because it just did not fit the needs of the team using it. So let's wipe the slate clean and start again. Now, if you remember the objective from last session, it's there to set direction and inspire action. It should be memorable, it should matter, and it should come up in conversation easily. It can, however, be quite ambiguous. The objective can be subjective, if you will. That's where key results come in. They clarify, measure, and empower. They don't need to be memorable, but they do need to be clear. The key results should be objective, if you're enjoying that particular play on words. We'll get into tips for setting OKRs shortly, but let's take a look at the format first. What do key results look like? We'll start with the two most common types of key results, metrics and milestones. For a metric, you want to use this format. Verb, the metric from start to target, right? I'm just going to go through these separately. So you need a verb because you need action. You usually want to increase or decrease. So increase or decrease, this metric is the right thing to do. Don't get too creative here. Just use a simple verb that makes sense. And try to stay away from verbs like improve. It's not always obvious with improve is an increase or a decrease. So you're adding some cognitive load to people when they're having to think about this. The metric is the name of the number you're working on. Selecting this metric is usually the hardest part. So a lot of what we'll talk about in this session is about how to select the metric. Now, you don't need the full definition here. You don't need a formula or all of the clauses about it, as long as the definition is clear and recorded somewhere. Now, you need to have that recorded somewhere because you don't want people interpreting this metric differently. You said, for example, you might say traffic and someone says, oh, I thought you meant page views, not unique visitors. And now you have a debate about what it means. Now, we say from start. The start is often forgotten because it's not always, people doesn't feel necessary, but it really helps to include in your key result the baseline you're starting from. It means we can more easily see the change we want to create and make it clearer what we're trying to do. And during the quarter, it's very easy to find the current metric from where we are now and compare it to the baseline. And now we know whether we are improving or not, whether we're on target. And finally, to target. And the target is obvious in some ways, but it makes a lot more sense when you have the starting point recorded as well. Now, I've got it down the bottom by this date. Now, normally that would be the end of the quarter or whatever period you're using, so you don't need to say it explicitly. But sometimes you may need to say something explicitly, like, for example, a particular conference or compliance deadline, and you want to have the date in there. It depends on what you need. Now, some metrics don't lend themselves neatly to this form, and often that means you've got the wrong metric. And we'll talk about tips to choose the right metric in a bit, but sometimes you might just need another format, and there are a few formats we can discuss shortly. First, the other type of key result is a milestone key result. This is the other major, most common type. It's on the right of the screen. Now, this is a simpler form. It's basically verb, create, launch, deliver, a milestone, right? Again, always start with a verb. Just use a simple verb. You usually have to be a bit more meaningful with this, depending on what your milestone is. But use the right verb for the milestone and make it so it's a really crystal clear verb. And then the milestone that you want. Now, in this case, you'll probably want the date. Some people don't like milestone key results because they feel a bit close to a task. And there is a danger that if you rely on these too much, that it can degenerate into a fancy to-do list, and it's just not as useful as it could be. But sometimes a milestone is critical and you do need to use it. And trying to find a metric to replace the milestone with ends up being artificial and misleading. The key here is to make sure that the milestone you're using matters to your customers. Not just a little bit, but that it's a critical customer-facing milestone. An example of this is to launch a product by a particular industry conference. You may also find, by the way, that certain compliance deadlines fit well into this because you have to comply with this requirement by a certain date. Now, I want to give you 3 other sample key result formats on this screen. Remember, you're always trying to clarify, measure, and empower, but there are different situations that require a different approach. So we've already talked about improvements and milestones, so I won't go through those again. There's quality control type key results, there's operationalization type key results, and there's investigation type key results. You can have other types, don't be constrained by this, but these are common examples. So quality control type key results, you're basically saying maintain a metric above or below X or at X or within a certain amount of X, something like that. Now, this type of key result is usually needed only when you really want to constrain the solution space for another key result. For example, you might have one key result about increasing traffic to the website, say unique visitors per week, and then you'll have this one saying maintain ad spend below X, because otherwise it would be easy to just buy more traffic, and that's not what you want given your strategy. Often you can better manage this kind of thing with a metrics deck or some other tools, which we'll talk about in the execution cadence section, but sometimes it's really helpful to have explicitly a quality control key result. Operationalization type key results. Things like start measuring the metric. This is useful, especially when you're starting out and don't have a lot of metrics, or you're missing a key metric that you think is really important that you know you're going to want to optimize and improve like next quarter. It's a bit of a variation on the milestone key result, but it's often set with a date early in the quarter and paired with a key result to increase that metric from X to Y. And then once you start measuring the metric, you can then set the right X and Y in the middle of the quarter. Finally, we have investigation key results. Things like answer this question or test that hypothesis. And now you may need to change the verb here, the answer or test, to be something that makes sense. But these are often used for product discovery type processes where you might have a preference for the result you want, but what you really need is a truthful answer to that question or the test of the hypothesis. For example, you might have test if more engagement leads to more referrals as a key result. This is testing if there's a relationship between increasing engagement and increasing referrals. Now, rather, you could do this instead of saying increase referrals, because what you're trying to do here is figure out, is there a relationship, so that then I know how to increase referrals. I'm trying to answer that question of how. I'm in a discovery mode. If you wish to just say increase referrals from X to Y, there are many other ways of doing this. But if you specifically are trying to test things, you could use a test type key result. Okay, but while I'm suggesting these as formats, don't overemphasize the rules or formats here. That's not necessary. You need to focus on what works for your team in your context, not on getting perfect key results. In the next video, we'll go through some example key results.